Welcome to my channel, Too Many Niches. Today's topic: bigamy and murder and swindling? What? Johann Hoch had many wives. Many wives had Johann Hoch. And Johann had many names, and at least one murder to one of those names. Hey, did he have a cool nickname too, like most murderers? Yep. Modern Bluebeard. The year is 1905, Chicago, though Hoch's ways started well before then, and not just in Chicago. In order to tell the story, kind of have to start in the middle. When Johann's name would first become publicly known as he was pursued by law enforcement for his wily ways. Johann Hoch was arrested in New York, and at this point in time, his charges were for being married one too many times, simultaneously, aka bigamy. Upon his arrest, he gave one of many of his fake names, Henry Bartles, remember that, but soon told the truth, but only about his fake names. At this time, he gave his real name as John Joseph Adolf Hoch, age 45, a machinist who lived on Union Avenue in Chicago. He also claimed at his arrest to be a much abused man, but would not disclose any details regarding that. Only married twice, he reported, and that his first wife was alive. Oh, is that so? Johann made fast work. He arrived at the New York boarding house on a Saturday, had not been there for 20 minutes when he asked to help the landlady with meal prep. That's a lovely gesture, right? That Monday, after a nice long Sunday chat with her, he had proposed marriage. And she told the police. Good for her. He literally chatted her up a lot. Intuition people, don't ignore it. She had heard about the search for the bigamist and thought, this could be him. And the wheels of justice were set in motion. So let's stick this car in reverse for a minute. Hoch was thought to have come from Horweiler, Germany. He had been a wine merchant in Germany, and with his association with high society, developed those manners that some would find charming. After some sort of light criminal behavior, perhaps the swindling part, he left his wife and children destitute. After his many misdeeds were laid down all over Germany, Germany was glad he left and would like their restitution. At some point, he crossed the big pond and found his way to America. Let's just set up some of the bigamy activities he was involved in, many which didn't come out until his trial. 1896, married Martha Hertzfeld. She gave him $600, and 4 months after their marriage, he gave her the heave-ho and disappeared. After that, Mary Hoch of Wheeling, West Virginia, 3 months post-nuptials. She dies of nephritis. He actually did deny this marriage ever taking place. You want more juicy gossip? Supposedly, a Johann Schmidt residing in Cincinnati between 1896 and 1897 was actually Johann Hoch. Well, so what? Because he married a woman, Mrs. Henry Bartles, remember that name? A mere 4 months after the death of her husband, and then she died mysteriously 3 months later. And then he married a Mrs. Fred Dis, saloon keeper widow. Now, nothing is said about what happened then because it was reported that Mrs. Fred Dis married again and lived in Ohio, but she identified a photo of Hoch as Schmidt. Supposedly, she gave him $700 and he said adios. Well, not literally, because that would have meant she knew he was actually leaving. He allegedly attended Saengerfest, a festival of singers, in Davenport, Illinois in 1898. While there, he asked for private boarding, trying to chat up the property owner, Mrs. Shriver. That didn't work, so he started working on her stepdaughter. That seemed to work until Mrs. Shriver put an end to it. Johann apparently said to heck with all this conflict and left Davenport. 1898, arrested for selling mortgaged furniture, served 2 years in the House of Corrections. 1901, Mrs. Ann Gurka of Chicago couldn't get any money from her, left her. An interesting story about how Johann may have enticed women into marrying him. He allegedly posed as a Bavarian count with the name of Otto von Kern. Anyway, one particular woman he conned was Hulda Nagel from St. Paul, Minnesota in May 1902. Count had his new countess to cash in some real estate she owned. While she was getting ready for a trip abroad post-wedding, the count broke into her trunk and stole her money, $3,000, and then he conveniently disappeared. I guess we can count him out. 1902, Mrs. Mary Becker died early 1903. Relative claims she was poisoned. 1903, Hammond, Indiana. Anna Schmidt Hendrickson got married. 2 days later, he left with $500 of her savings. He had told her he was an heir to an estate to Germany. Then he comes in with a cablegram, fake, which said his father had died. He told Anna he was going to get $21,000 from the estate and she needed to get ready to leave. Presently, he had no money for the trip, hence the $500 she gave him, and boom, done, gonzo. Mrs. Amelia Falke Hoch said she had married Hoch 2 years earlier, about 1903. After the marriage commenced, she had become very ill after she took some white powder given to her by her husband. Her doctor gave her an emetic so she would vomit, which she believed saved her life. Unfortunately, some of the powder was given to a cat, and the cat died. I'm assuming by the way this was written that this was more of an experimentation by the doctor to the cat, which, good Lord, necessary? Anyway, the lady's father identified Hoch as a man his daughter had married. You like a good yarn about a baddie? I do. One story was that he requested some furniture from a dealer for 5 different flats. Each flat was under a different name. Each flat had a different wife. The dealer said that in 3 of those 5 flats, the wives had died shortly after marriage. The dealer, who appeared to me to also be an amateur detective, asked, why the different names? Hoch's reply was that basically he didn't think he could get married under the same name every time and that women would object to marrying someone who was a frequent widower. Yeah, Johann, that would be an eyebrow raiser and deal breaker for some. So hey, what about the murder? We want murder. You want murder? This poor woman didn't want it and didn't deserve it. Marie Walker was a widow who owned a candy business, and unfortunately she had answered one of his I want companionship ads. Think old school Craigslist. After a whirlwind courtship, he took her to his place. They married December 10th, 1904. She got rid of her store, turned the sale money over to her husband. He had told her he was already rich. He had no need for her money, but, oh hey, I'll invest it for you. Isn't that sweet? And she died just days later. Another article said a month, but the consensus seemed to be days. The coroner originally stated that he didn't think she had been poisoned. Death by natural causes, he says. Nephritis in this case. But hang on tight, kids. He will change his mind. And then get this. Marie's sister, yes, murdered Marie. Her sister, Mrs. Fisher Hoch, was proposed to by Johann shortly after her sister died. Johann gave Mrs. Fisher quite the sob story, but she did resist. And then again, he proposed to her literally over the grave of his wife / her sister. And then within a week, I believe, she said yes. The day after they wed, he asked her for $750 so he could pay off a mortgage on the house they were now residing in. She gave it to him, and he became one with the wind and disappeared. To her credit, she contacted the police. Remember the wishy-washy coroner? He soon stated on re-examination with some colleagues that the arsenic found in her blood had not been rendered to her by any physician treating her prior to her death. That would mean that the arsenic had been rendered to her by someone with nefarious purposes. So we got the bigamy, and now let's add that murder charge to the docket. Hoch, still held up in New York, is giving interviews now. I have a feeling he would have embraced YouTube or Facebook had they been available back in olden times. Anywho, though labeled a bigamist, swindler, and now probably a murderer, he has, quote, maintained an attitude of most hilarious frivolity throughout the conversation, end quote. He apparently really wanted to get back to Chicago for some odd reason so he could chat with police. You okay? He got a real big kick out of his alleged list of wives and accused some of the women of having unidentified deserted husbands and accusing him instead to save face. Our modern Bluebeard was indicted as a bigamist and swindler and soon would be indicted on a charge of murder. 3 of his supposed wives were witnesses. The women met at the court for the first time, awkward, but had a friendly exchange, according to one newspaper, no doubt glad they got away from this man. These particular women were Marie Emily Fisher, Anna Hendrickson, and Marie Girk. As of February 7th, the total number of wives was allegedly 29. February 10th, in court on entering the jury room, Johann finally admitted to having married 13 women in 10 years. 8 of these women had reportedly died by this point. He declared, of course, that they all died of natural causes and he had nothing to do with it. February 13th, 1905, Johann's attorney wants Johann to be declared insane. Johann wouldn't state anything for the record, but it was thought that he was not happy with this declaration. He stated, quote, "Am I crazy? If you ask me, I say that everybody is crazy, only some more as others." End quote. Yeah, I go along with that. Probably the sanest thing he's ever said. Interesting that while he was telling the press this, he was having dinner in his cell and waving a glass of beer around. Okay. Whatever came of this insanity plea, I never saw it come up again, but considering that the trial moved forward, I assume nothing actually came of that, if the attorneys did actually try to have it brought forward. So why in 1905 if he's been doing these things since 1881, according to some sources? It's possible the fact that this is just now becoming a story in 1905 is due to the hesitancy of women to tell the world that they have been left by their spouse and duped in some cases, relieved of their money or belongings. Johann even brought up in the early days of this that, quote, "I suppose I've got to suffer for every man that ever deserted a woman and could not be found afterwards. Come on, ladies, if any of you have lost husbands and don't know what has become of them, just step around and identify me. If any lady has disappeared in the last 20 years, just say she was one of Hoch's wives. Oh, this is rich." End quote. Lovely. Anyway, he would never look to beautiful women. He actually wanted women who would not have other men barging down her door. He didn't want competition, I guess, and thought that more unattractive women may be easier and may not have had much in the way of tenderness shown to them. One of his alleged love letters said, quote, "Dear child, you took my heart by storm. I can't get over it, my dear Joanna. How is it with you, dear child? You like to spend the rest of your life alone. If you only feel towards me as I feel and could bring one half of your love to me as I to you, how lucky I would be. If you could wed your heart to mine for the rest of our days, I would be the luckiest man in the world." End quote. Ha! Thankfully, though his words bespelled this particular lady, somehow she had been given the care of a letter from another woman intended for him that ended with the words, "love and kisses." And thankfully, she skedaddled. There are some gaps in getting news from newspapers, so I'm assuming the February 1905 court dealings was for a grand jury case to see if there was enough probable cause to proceed to an actual trial. Because then, on May 19th, 1905, the trial is now over, and Johann was found guilty of murder in the first degree, and it only took the jury less than a half hour. First ballot taken among the jurors, guilty. Second ballot for the punishment part, taken among the jurors, 10 in favor of death penalty, 2 for life imprisonment. Third ballot, all 12 jurors voted for death penalty. Attorneys will ask for a new trial, though Hoch appeared to just wanted to get the hanging over with and didn't want his attorneys to bother. But then he stated that the jurors got it wrong, so even a prison guard tried to cheer him up, stating, "While there's life, there's hope, you know." Johann replied, quote, "Not for me. It's all over and John was gonna die." End quote. And then he whistled a jovial tune and went back to his cell. So here's another gap in news. He was supposed to hang June 23rd as his motion for a new trial was overturned, but he wasn't hanged. He had requested a reprieve so that he could present his case to the Supreme Court in the June term. Governor Deneen of Illinois allowed a 5.5-week reprieve. Johann wanted to contest the right of a woman to testify against her husband in a criminal case. State proved that he had married the woman after he had married another woman who was still living at the time, from whom he was never divorced. None of Johann's friends, if he had any, presented their cases for him to the court, though that they had been given time to do so, and apparently none of the justices had received the case for review. He was sentenced to hang on July 28th. But stop the presses! Again! On July 28th, a mystery woman, allegedly a Mrs. May Wilson, put up the $500 for another reprieve of 4 weeks to allow the Supreme Court to review Johann's appeal. She declared herself to be a friend of the Governor Deneen. She was apparently interested in the case from a humanitarian motive only, believing he should have an equal chance. In other odd news that we didn't ask for but are still interested in, he apparently slept well the night before the hanging. That never happened. He woke up once and felt nauseous and then fell back asleep. He had coffee and rolls for breakfast. He wore a plain black suit, packed his items, and gave the guard a picture of him and his wife. Which one? When he thought he was being hanged, he was allowed to see a spiritual advisor and his attorney, and I believe another pastor. As the time approached, he became less spirited, but declared his innocence for murder. He was sent flowers, but was not allowed to have them in case that poison may have been concealed in them. Deneen, who had previously stated he would not interfere with this matter, still allowed the 4-week extension, though not all of the funds were in hand. In an interesting stroke of irony prior to his assumed hanging, Johann had told his attorney to get out there and get the money for him to present his case. The attorney asked how. Hoch said he should rob someone or kill a millionaire. Yeah, you may want to choose your words better. The jail crowd, bereft of some exciting gallows activity that day, probably not unlike getting to go on a field trip when you're a kid, was in shock and shouted, which was heard for blocks. Shouting hooray or darn it, I don't know. Newspaper opinions were also not too happy. One paper, the Delta Independent, stated, quote, "The fact that a woman has furnished the desired amount to appeal the case of Johann Hoch only demonstrates the fact that there is no telling just what a woman will do." End quote. Yeah, buddy, we're enigmas. Sometimes we don't even understand ourselves, or men. So, touche. Yeah, so this is confusing, but apparently, though I couldn't find mention of it, he was supposed to have been executed on August 26th after that 4-week reprieve. But that hanging was put on hold under a writ of supersedeas, as a review of his case would come up before the Supreme Court in October. So now it's mid-October. You still there, kids? Supreme Court was due to receive the case with oral arguments and briefs to be presented, but no decision would actually be rendered before the December term. By October 17th, the presentation was completed. Supreme Court could only rule on the one item that Hoch had brought the contention about, i.e., not wanting his wife to be allowed to testify against him. They basically said that, yes, his wife could testify against him, which is not what he wanted. Now we're jumping to February 1906. If you felt like you've just lost your mind in the story, no worries, chickadees, we're coming to a close. A couple of days before his scheduled hanging on February 23rd, 1906, he wanted his sentence changed to life in prison. Nope! Death penalty will stand. Johann was hanged at Cook County Jail at 1:34 p.m. on February 23rd, 1906. His attorneys were able to cause a delay of a few hours, but the execution went forward. The delay was caused by the attorneys going to the U.S. Circuit Court to file an application of a writ of habeas corpus on the grounds that he was held in peril of death in violation of the 14th Amendment. You know, that whole lack of due process thing. But the judge denied the writ and the hanging commenced. Even post-hanging, the attorneys said that they would appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court, and if not reversed, they would try to have all that participated in the hanging indicted for murder. Considering that I never heard anything about that later, I'm assuming that nothing came of that. Johann ate his hearty dinner, didn't say what it was, I'm the one that finds that interesting, and he walked to the scaffold quietly, pale and composed. He was asked for his final words, and he said, "Father, forgive them, they know not what they do. I must die an innocent man. Goodbye." Johann did confess to a reverend attending the hanging that he was indeed a bigamist, but it's unknown, because the reverend told no one, if he had ever confessed to murder. So now that Johann is no longer alive, no cemetery would have him, even though the undertaker said that he would have him interred at his own expense, and with the support of a couple of clergymen. So Johann was interred into a potter's field which joined the county's poor farm. And so ends the story of Johann Hoch. Though he had been mentioned in later years, I was unable to find out if he had indeed actually murdered more women than poor Marie Welker, or had more wives than what was thought. Because the newspapers were reporting numbers of wives from like 30 to 60. In any case, for the sake of these women's families, I hope not. Rest in peace to all who were affected by him in any way. Thank you so much for watching and listening. If you're interested in seeing more, please like and subscribe, and have a wonderful day.